Now I'm going to import http.dart, and I'm going to give it a variable name so that I can reference that variable name instead of using its classes just like that. So what is our dependency going to be? It's going to be an http.client. We're using the raw HTTP client, and I'm going to call that a client. Remember, I always make my dependencies private. Final auth remote data source implementation, this.client. We take that in a constructor. In the actual application, not final const. In the actual application, we will be using Firebase, Firestore, Firebase authentication, and the rest of them. So we'll rather be using those in the constructor instead of the HTTP client. But then those ones require different style of testing. So this is why I'm teaching you this, because in most of your projects with your companies, you might not be using Firebase directly. You might have a backend guy who's building it out in Python, using Django or Flask or whatever, or maybe Node.js and Mongo. So you need to know how to write tests with HTTP. This is why we're doing this part. So let's go ahead and write the tests for this. So in our auth remote data source test, let's start by creating our dependency. In this case, the HTTP client. So mock client extends mock import auto import implements http.client. http.dart. We have to add that variable name as http so that it will reflect over here. So now you can see we don't only mock the classes that we've created, we can also mock dependencies from external libraries. So now we're going to have total control on whether the HTTP client will return a proper data or not. Let's go ahead and start writing the test. Let me go ahead and close that up. After that, we can start with our void main entry point. At this point, we're always going to be writing void mains in our code. Void main, we can go ahead and start by writing the client. So this time we have an http.client. Remember, I prefer to take the raw object in the declaration, but then when I'm instantiating it, I use the mock version. So that way I can know, I don't know, just feels better that way. You can do the other thing as well. I don't know. Late what? So we've taken our dependency. Now let's go ahead and take our our actual class, our actual unit. So this is the remote data source. We're going to set up async. No, you're not async. I'm so sorry. I'm used to using async a lot. So first of all, let's instantiate the dependency. It will be a mock client. And finally, the remote data source will take the client. It will be an authentication remote data source. Come on, auto-complete it for me. Authentication remote data source. Yes, this is sorry. So over here, this is the abstract class. We can't instantiate the abstract class, so we're rather going to instantiate the implementation of it. So we're rather testing the implementation, not the actual abstract class. So I'm so sorry. But over here, I'm totally just going to put the name of the actual object instead of its implementation. Then over here, when I'm instantiating it, I will rather use the implementation. So let's go ahead and do that. Auth remote data source implementation takes the client. So we're done setting up. Let's go ahead and start our testing. So remember, we are going to be writing tests for two different methods. So for that, we need two different groups for these tests. So let me go ahead and group. Also, you can actually put a group in the group. So for example, create user. I could have a different group in here for maybe a smaller subsection. Maybe I want to break down my tests. Maybe instead of joining these two tests together, like I did here, I joined this test and that test together. If you wanted to break them down, but also group them as one specific, I don't know, one specific group or something. For some reason, it might come up sometime in your coding where you have to test write two different tests while in a group, but then those two different tests should have their own, you feel like they should have their own group still inside of that main group. You can totally do that. That's valid. You can have a group inside of a group. That works. You can have a different group. So that all works. But we're not going to do that. Let's go ahead and write a test. Let me save this. Data sources. Save to dictionary. Right. So we want to check first to make sure that it returns the right data when the status code is 200. In our case, a post request will return 200 or 201. So we want to check for both since we know we're doing a post request. So should complete successfully because we're not returning anything. It's a void function when the status code is 200 or 201. Async L. There we go. So we start by stubbing the HTTP client. So we say that when our client posts, because this is the function we're going to be calling in the client in this function. In the remote data source, we're actually going to be doing a post request. So we want to say that whenever we call a post request and the URL, this time the URL is a positional param. You can see that over here. It's a positional argument. We can instead use any without adding in the named inside of it. So when the post request gets called with any URL, but then remember that we're going to be passing in some data, the body that we're going to use for creating the user. In this case, we're going to be passing in the username. What is it? What are we passing in? What do we need? The creator, that the name, and the avatar. So when that happens, our body, we're going to be passing in any named body. This time the body is going to be a string, so I think it can take care of a string without us explicitly having to give it or having to register a fallback value for our mock arguments. So in this case, it's the body. We can say .then answer. This is a future. A post request returns a future response. You can see. So we're going to use the answer instead of a return. Let me go ahead and close up that invocation. Async. So if you've done anything at all with the HTTP library in Dart, you know that it returns a response. So that's where we can say response.body, response.status code, and so forth and so on. So it returns a response. So we're going to create a fake response. So let me go ahead and do that here because we're going to be using those responses for the two different whatever. No, we're going to be using it once actually in here, so I don't think get uses the same response. So it will be http dot response. It has a response object. Should I put a comma or not? So this response wants something. It wants, yeah, it wants. I think it wants the data and the status code. So I could just put the status code this time 201. And the response will be maybe user created successfully. Remember, this will return void, but it doesn't mean that the server will not have a response. The server usually returns, sometimes the server actually returns the user's data after you create the user. It will return 201, meaning created, and then it will return the data of that user in that creation, for that creation. So where I'm actually just going to leave this way. Sometimes it can also just return a statement like success. User created successfully. So we've created our fake response. Now, let's go ahead and act. What is our action? Final result will be equal to await. Our action will be the remote data source dot create user. And it's going to create the user. We've created that name and the avatar. Let's go ahead and create those. Final. Do you know what? Let me just convert these to strings. I don't have to go through that stress of creating that again. So now, oh my, stop. Now we will simply expect that the result is equal to, so what will be returned here when the success? It will be equal to nothing, a future value. It will be equal to void. But remember, we can't return a void. That wouldn't work. Sorry, void. That wouldn't work. So you can either return a future value, right? Or you can say this. There's another way to do this. You can do this. You can make sure that the result completes. But you can see now that the expression is of type void, so it can't be used. What does that mean? It means that this actually completes and then returns as a value, and then we're checking if that value completes. But complete actually tells us if the thing on the left completes, meaning that the thing on the left should be a function. So in order to do that, let's just go ahead and save the name, or say the name of the function here. So the method call. So the method call, this is a method call. We're just going to save that method call over there, and we can simply say, make sure that that method call, that when it gets called with these values, right, that it completes successfully. You can go ahead and add this back here. Simply say that whenever higher order function calls this method with these values, that it completes successfully. And then you can go ahead and say verify that the clients.posts actually got called, and it got called with any URL. We don't want any URL. We want our actual URL. And how are we going to get that? Let's go ahead and pop up a Chrome tab, and find